A very good evening to all of you. I welcome you all to the ICANN initiative, the Hindu and Indian Express analysis. So today we'll start with a discussion of the newspaper articles and editorials. Today we have totally 9 topics to cover, which belongs to today's 2 newspapers and Saturday's 2 newspapers. So totally today we'll be covering 4 newspapers, and we have too many things to cover today. As I told, we have 9 topics to be covered. So I'll just speed up a little bit. So see if you're comfortable with the speed. So the first topic of the day is FCRA and also the regulation of NGOs. Anything that is related to regulation of NGOs and civil society organization is a part of your GS2 syllabus. So there were basically 2 articles related to this FCRA amendment. So you may be asked what were the recent amendments that have been proposed in the FCRA, and why is it that these amendments have been proposed. So first of all, you'll have to know the basics of what FCRA is, and a part of which we have already discussed in the last class. So FCRA is Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. So when the act was enacted in 2010, it basically dealt with 2 important things. One is the acceptance of the foreign contribution, and the other is the utilization of the same. So one is acceptance and the other is utilization. So the next question comes is acceptance and utilization of what? So in this what, there are 2 parts. One is you either accept and utilize foreign contribution, which will come in the form of funds, or you will accept and utilize foreign hospitality, which is not in the form of funds, but it is a form of hospitality. So maybe some tourist packages or something like that. So foreign hospitality. So both of them are covered under the FCRA. So even if you get a question in prelims under FCRA that it covers foreign hospitality also, so do not mark it as incorrect, because usually when we read the title, it is Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. So don't be under the impression that FCRA is only about foreign contribution. It also deals with foreign hospitality. So therefore, FCRA 2010 deals with acceptance and utilization of foreign contribution and foreign hospitality. So this is to what? What is the purpose of FCRA? So one is that it regulates the acceptance and utilization of foreign contribution and foreign hospitality by individuals and entities. So this is the first thing. Second, it regulates the acceptance and utilization of foreign contribution and foreign hospitality related to undertaking any activities which are detrimental to the national interest. So if any activity is being taken up by some of the organizations or some of the entities which are detrimental to the national interest, so whether these activities may be in the form of foreign contribution or in the form of foreign hospitality, then also it will come under FCRA. So this is the basic definition of FCRA. You can draw the same flowchart also in your exam. So now what made the government come out with an amendment? So now a bill has been tabled in the parliament for amending the FCRA. So why is it that the government wants to amend FCRA is a primary question. So I thought there are mainly 3 important reasons. One is the non-compliance. Non-compliance means FCRA, as we discussed in the last class, proposes some of the important few compliance guidelines which have to be followed by these NGOs. But most of these NGOs, some of these NGOs they don't comply with these provisions. For example, there are provisions in FCRA which makes the submission of income tax returns and maintenance of proper accounts by these NGOs mandatory. But this is not complied with. Some of the NGOs don't even maintain their accounts, and some of them don't file their income tax returns regularly. So therefore, there is a general non-compliance that is prevalent, and this needs to be tackled because they are accepting a lot of foreign funds, and this basic compliance is must. Second is these NGOs may also have some anti-national agenda, as we just discussed in the previous slide, that these funds or hospitality, the foreign, can be used to carry out activities which are against the national interest. So therefore, we also need to keep a tab on them so that they don't end up carrying out any activities which are detrimental to our national interest. And thirdly, whatever foreign contribution or hospitality an individual or an entity may be receiving, that could be misused. There could be misappropriation of those funds and misutilization of those funds. So because of these reasons, it has become this has provided the context for the government to introduce an amendment now in the form of a bill in the parliament. Now with this context, let us look at some of the important amendments that has been proposed now in the FCRA. The first amendment talks about Aadhaar. Before we start with the amendments, I forgot to mention one important piece of data. So in the previous slide, we were discussing about the lack of compliance by the NGOs. So because of lack of compliance, the center has time and again been forced to cancel the registrations of several NGOs because they don't comply with the provisions of FCRA. So in that regard, between 2011 and 2019, nearly 19,000 registrations have been cancelled by the center, which also includes many NGOs. So these many registrations have been cancelled for receipt of foreign contribution and not complying with the guidelines under the FCRA. So this data you can mention while you are making your case for making FCRA more stronger and for regulation of NGOs. So you can use this data to make your argument stronger. So now let's come back to the amendments. So first is the Aadhaar. So what this amendments first thing that is proposed in the amendment is that Aadhaar as an identification document, as an ID, will be made mandatory for the important office bearers of the NGOs, for the directors of the NGOs, and also for the key functionaries who are working in these NGOs. These Aadhaar will be made mandatory. So this is one thing, whichever NGO is receiving foreign contribution, for them the Aadhaar identity for the office bearers, the directors and the key functionaries will be made mandatory. Second is an expansion of the ineligible category. So there are few individuals or entities which are not eligible to receive foreign funding. So this category has been expanded by including two items under this. One is the public servant, and the second thing is a corporate owned or corporation owned or controlled by the government. So it's a corporation owned or controlled by government. So these are some of the entities that have been brought under the category of those individuals or entities which are not eligible to receive foreign funding. Why? Because now this category of public servant. So public servant has the public servant has to always keep the public ahead of the private. So there is a public agenda which is set by the government. So receiving foreign funding by a public servant and using it to propagate their own agenda does not fit or match with each other. So therefore now the public servant has been put under the category that a public servant is ineligible to receive foreign funding under FCRA. Similarly, those corporations which are owned or controlled by the government have also been put under the ineligible category. So in fact, it is because of this that in 2016, the Home Ministry had cancelled the license of a lawyers collective. So this lawyers collective also had the member Indira Jaising, and Indira Jaising during that time was additional Solicitor General of Government, and that this lawyers collective had received nearly more than 95 crores of foreign funding. So therefore the government cancelled the registration of this lawyers collective because Indira Jaising was a part of the collective, and also she held the post of Additional Solicitor General, which comes under the category of a public servant. And another amendment that is proposed recently is related to the administrative expenses. So earlier the cap that was provided for administrative expenses was 50%. That is, if I get 100 rupees of foreign funding, I will be able to use 50 rupees for my administrative purposes. That is, I will need 50 rupees to run my NGO, basically for the basic staff and the basic infrastructure. I will require 50%. I will be at max able to spend 50% of this. That is 50 rupees I'll be able to spend on administrative expenses, and rest 50 rupees I can spend on whatever cause my NGO is upholding. But now this administrative expenses limit has been brought down to 20%. That is, I can spend only 20% of the foreign funding that I receive on administrative expenses, while the rest of 80% should go to a stated purpose or the objective. So thereby what is happening is, earlier a lot of expenses were a lot of the foreign contribution that were received were shown as expenses. So whenever a business claims more amount or more amount of money as expense, then its net income will be reduced. So that is what the NGOs did, that they received funding but they showed a lot of this funding as expenses. So now this cap has been put on administrative expenses at just 20%, so that the remaining 80% can be used for the objective of the NGO or the purpose for which the NGO is working. So these are some of the important amendments that has been now proposed in the FCRA amendment bill that has now been tabled in the parliament. So now we'll move on to the next topic. The next topic we're going to discuss is the regulation of hate speech or the regulation of media. So this again is a part of your GS2 syllabus, because freedom of expression per se is an article in the Constitution, Article 19, which is a fundamental right. So this is about basically a discussion around this fundamental right. So it is part of your GS2 syllabus. So the issue that was related to the Sudarshan TV and the program that it aired, which was Bindas Bol, we just discussed it last Friday, where we saw how this program that was aired by the Sudarshan TV, what it showed in Bindas Bol as a program was, it was trying to say that these Muslims in the country are trying to conspire to infiltrate the Indian bureaucracy. So it even cast questions on the UPSC, and it held that the Muslims are conspiring to completely infiltrate the Indian civil services. So now in regard to this, whether this can be called as hate speech and how must media be regulated, that is what we are going to be discussing. So the first thing we have to understand is that we need to have a clarity about when a speech should be called as offensive and when a speech becomes a hate speech. That is only when we have this clarity can we properly regulate speech. So we are talking about regulation of speech and regulation of media. For that, we need to know when we talk about freedom of expression under Article 19 of the Constitution, and when we talk of regulating this freedom of expression, we need to be very clear about when a particular speech is just offensive speech and when it degenerates and when it becomes turns into hate speech. So in this regard, this clarity is very much important, because offensive speech may just hurt the sentiments of few people, but just by being offensive to a segment of the society, the speech itself does not become illegal. But if the speech is a hate speech, which is trying to incite violence and criminal activities among the masses, then that amounts to hate speech, and hate speech is criminal in nature. So that is the reason why we need to distinguish between the two, so that we understand clearly which one is the one which we need to regulate. Because extreme regulation of even offensive speech may hamper Article 19. So by properly understanding the difference between these two is necessary for us to because that is when we can properly regulate the speech. So hate speech is one which incites violence, which incites hatred and discrimination, that is based upon a collective identity. That is, it is based upon collective identity means it can be religion, it can be caste, it can be gender, sex. So all of these are the collective identity. So based on the collective identity, hate speech tries to incite violence, hatred and discrimination. So this can be cited as a definition of hate speech, and this needs to be differentiated from something that is just an offensive speech. For example, this editorial also gives an example to show this. For example, if I condemn, or if I say something wrong about the tenets of Buddhism in general, then it might hurt the sentiments of the Buddhists. So it may be called as an offensive speech which is offending the sentiments of the Buddhists. But I am not calling the Buddhists to take up arms and incite violence among them. So this may not amount to hate speech. So just saying that the tenets of Buddhism are useless may be an offensive one which is leading to hurting the sentiments of Buddhists, but it is not hate speech per se. But if I am saying that all the Buddhists are immoral and all that, so that is hateful, because that is trying to incite some hatred and discrimination based on somebody's identity as a Buddhist. So I am branding all the Buddhists as immoral. So therefore that amounts to hate speech. So while offensive speech may not be termed as illegal and too much of restrictions may not be imposed on offensive speech, but on hate speech we need to regulate and put a stop to it. So that is where we need to come out with restrictions under Article 19, so that hate speech is curbed, because that is criminal in nature. So this understanding this difference is very important, and this Sudarshan TV issue has given us an opportunity where we can debate and come out with this clarity on the difference between offensive and hate speech. so that on the one hand, while we regulate hate speech, on the other hand, we don't end up over regulating such that it endangers our right to freedom itself under Article 19. So in this regard, then how do we tackle it? The first thing is, as we just discussed, we need to have clarity on whether something is an offensive speech or something is a hate speech. So on this, we need to have more clarity. The second is, it is always said that the best antidote to hate speech is more speech. So you give the person an opportunity to speak out, and that is when you will realize how hollow or how hollow somebody's argument is. So then you can yourself decide whether this person is speaking the truth or not, and there is no chance that I will be incited based on somebody else's views. So therefore, the best antidote to hate speech is more speech. Allow more speech, more debates, more discussions in the country. Give that more democratic space in the country where people can talk to each other, deliberate and discuss upon an issue. So that is when this hate speech will get curbed by itself. So more speech is one way to tackle this. Next is the hate speech laws. When I talk of the hate speech laws, already our country has some hate speech laws, like for example section 153A of the IPC and section 295A of IPC. So section 153A deals with or it criminalizes speech which is trying to create enmity between different groups, and 295A, it criminalizes those speech which hurt or outrage the religious feelings of people. So there are these sections in the IPC, but when you go through those sections, you see that they are very vaguely worded. So this needs to be made more precise. We need to amend these acts so that this ambiguity or the vagueness that is there in these acts are removed. So this is one more thing that we have to do. The next thing is, we have to ask ourselves what is more feared, whether it is hate or state. So this was stated by Pratap Bhanu Mehta in the editorial that came in the Indian Express, where he says that hate speech is something which needs to be curbed. So if you want to say that we need to curb hate speech in the country, which means we are trying to restrict the speech. So which has to be done if we really want to restrict hate speech. So restricting or regulating hate speech means that we are somewhere putting restrictions on our freedom under Article 19, which is the right to free speech. So when we say that we have to regulate hate speech, it means that we are giving the state, we are giving the government some powers. We are empowering the government to make some regulations and which may restrict our speech. So by regulating hate speech, we are empowering the state to make more regulations which may restrict the speech. So when we regulate hate speech, we will be making the state more stronger. So what is it more feared? Is hate speech more feared or a strong state which is more feared? When we are empowering the state with the power to make laws which can restrict our speech, which means we are giving more power to the state can become authoritarian and it may start restricting the speech of various people if it doesn't match their philosophy. So therefore, a too much authoritarian or powerful state which has the power to impose restrictions on our freedom of speech is also bad. At the same time, hateful speech is also bad. So there we have to have a fine balance between regulating hate speech on the one hand and empowering the state to impose restrictions on the freedom of speech on the other hand. So this balance we will have to strike when we think about tackling hate speech. So this is about the article on hate speech. We have understood what is the definition of hate speech. We can say that it is something that incites violence, hatred and discrimination based on a collective identity. So as far as hate speech is concerned, how do we tackle? We already know 4 good steps. We know an example which is related to the Sudarshan TV recent episode. So we have good enough content to write an answer on hate speech and regulation of media. Now we'll move on to the next topic. The next topic is good governance, which is again a part of your GS2 syllabus. So in GS2 we have good governance as a concept which is very important, and we have already discussed about good governance and what are the tenets of good governance. So we had also remembered the acronym CRAP-tree to remember the the various pillars of good governance. So if you remember CRAP-tree, in that P was related to people-centric and participative governance. So governance has to be more participatory with the involvement of the people who are the sovereign. Only then that is a very important pillar of good governance. So this is an example, the current farmer crisis that is going on is an example of what happens when there is a failure of citizen participation or people participation. So in this regard, government is now introducing some bills related to the farm sector in the parliament, for which there is a lot of opposition and the farmer groups are protesting against the introduction and passing of these bills. So the primary reason for this is that the intention of the government is only to reduce the control of the government over the APMC mandis, but the intention of the government is not to dismantle the MSP regime in the future. But however, there is an insecurity among the farmers that this is the first step towards corporatization of agriculture. Today, the government is weakening the control over the APMC mandis, and tomorrow it is going to withdraw the minimum support price also. So, due to fear of the withdrawal of MSP in the future, the farmers are opposing today and they are protesting today against the introduction of these bills in the parliament. So why has this happened is what this editorial says is it is less because of the content of the bill, because the bill is just trying to weaken the control of the government over the APMC mandis and giving more freedom for the development of other markets as well. But the intention of the government is not to withdraw the MSP. But however, the government has not been able to communicate this effectively to the farmers, because in the whole process of formation of these bills, the government has not held any consultations with the various stakeholders. Be it the farmers or be it the state governments, government has not held those consultations and these important stakeholders have not been involved. So farmers for whom this bill is meant, they are not involved in the process. State governments had to be involved because agriculture essentially is a state subject and this is a bill on the farm sector. So even the state governments have not been involved. So like that, the important stakeholders have not been consulted and involved by the government in the process of formation of these bills, and because of which today there is a mistrust and a misunderstanding between the farmers on the one hand and the government on the other, and between the central government on the one hand and the state governments on the other. So therefore we see here how the absence of public participation and people-centric governance can lead to such protests from the important stakeholders in the country for whom the policies are being made. So that this is a classic example which illustrates the importance of involvement of the public in the public policy formulation. So this is a classic example when you are writing any answer on people participation in governance. So you can quote this example. Now we move on to the next topic. The next topic is related to world peace or the refugee crisis. So refugee crisis is a part of your GS2 syllabus because the countries have their own laws on refugees and there is a United Nations Refugee Agency as well. So it will come under your GS2 syllabus. Also, if you're talking about world peace in general, you can have an essay topic on world peace. So it can come in your essay as well. So this whole article was about the international peace. Why? Because today, that is 21st September, is International Day of Peace. So that is why this whole article was on the world peace. But however, the contents of the article was not strong enough to be used or to talk about world peace. But one data is very important in this whole topic, which you can use it when you're writing an answer on refugee crisis. So you may have a question in your GS2 paper asking about what is India's refugee policy. So we are a country who are not a signatory to the United Nations that refugee convention, and also we do not have a very fixed refugee policy as well. So in such a case, you may have a question in GS2 paper about what does India stand on the various refugee crisis and what has been India's policy towards the same. So in that case, you can use this data, so which is that in the world by the end of 2019, there were 79.5 million people who were displaced across the world because of armed conflicts, persecution and other reasons according to the United Nations Refugee Agency. So this data you can use when you're writing about the refugee crisis across the world or about the Indian refugee policy. You can use this data in your answer that by the end of 2019, 79.5 million people were displaced because of armed conflicts, persecution and other reasons. So this data you can use it. there was nothing, other content of this article were not important. So now we'll move on to the next topic. The next topic is the Afghan peace process, which again is a part of your GS2 syllabus. And Afghan peace process we have already studied in great detail in the previous ICANN videos. The reason I will be talking about these two articles is because these two articles has enough scope where we can come out with some answer writing tips in general, which you will have to follow across your answers. So these tips are very useful, which you should follow in your answer writing if you really want to score that extra mark per question more. So through this Afghan peace process 2 editorials, I'll illustrate these answer writing tips. So I'm going to discuss that with you. So first is writing some important names. For example, when we talk of the Afghan peace process, so the US had begun negotiations with the Taliban to come to a ceasefire to stop violence and all that. So the US Taliban peace talks were happening some months before. So in this case, for negotiation with the Taliban, US had employed a special envoy, an ambassador, Khalilzad. So you can name such people who's while you are writing your answers, and that will add more value to the answer. So US was holding direct negotiations with Taliban, and that started nearly 2 years before. So direct negotiations of US and Taliban started some 2 years ago, during which US appointed the ambassador Khalilzad as the special envoy for carrying out this negotiating process. So writing such specific names and underlining them in your answer will give you that edge per question compared to the answers of the other aspirants. So writing such names is very important. Also, these people who you mentioned, they must have usually they give some important things which you can quote in the answer. For example, when Khalilzad was appointed as the ambassador for the US Taliban talks, so what Khalilzad did was he spelled out some 4 objectives of these negotiation between the US and the Taliban. So these 4 objectives, which everybody knows, but if you write it under the name of Khalilzad, that will give an added weight to your answer. So these 4 objectives which Khalilzad enunciated for the US Taliban talks were: first is to give up violence by accepting or by declaring a ceasefire. Second is there must be intra-Afghan dialogues. So as we all know now, the intra-Afghan dialogues are going on in Doha. So the Doha talks are on now, so intra-Afghan dialogues. And the third is that Taliban has to cut ties with terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda. This was the third objective. And fourth was the US troop withdrawal. So these were the 4-fold objectives with which the United States started its negotiations talks with Taliban 2 years before under the Ambassador Khalilzad as a special envoy. So by writing these 4 objectives, many people would know the 4 objectives. By writing this under the name of Khalilzad will give more weightage to your answer. So this is one tip. The second is you need to use some catchy representation while you're writing your answer, so that it stands out from the rest of the answers. For example, in this case, when US was negotiating with Taliban, there was a 3-way negotiation that was happening. So this 3-way negotiation was what? One was the Doha track. So the Doha track, in which the United States was trying to deal with the Taliban. So that was the Doha track. Second was the Islamabad track. So in the Islamabad track, US was negotiating with Pakistan. Why? Because Pakistan was very important player if the Taliban had to be brought to the negotiating table. So that way United States was dealing with the Pakistan also, so the Islamabad track. And third was the Kabul track. So Kabul track, where United States was dealing with the Afghanistan government per se. So these are the 3-way negotiations that the US was holding. So when you mention this 3-way negotiation, and if you draw this triangle and mention the Doha track, the Islamabad track and Kabul track, it gives a very different representation of the content that you want to express. So that will definitely be very catchy and attractive to the evaluator, and he will see that you have understood the process very clearly. So such catchy representation, whenever you find across while reading anything, you have to take a note of it separately and make sure that you include such things in your answers. The third important tip is the expert's opinion. So all of these things were written by, this whole article was in fact written by Rakesh Sood. Rakesh Sood, as you all know, was India's ambassador to Afghanistan. So while writing about India or the Afghan peace process and India's role in it, by mentioning Rakesh Sood and mentioning some of the points as opinion or expert opinion of Rakesh Sood, who has been the former ambassador of Afghanistan, will add more value to your answer. So adding such expert's opinion is also very important when you're writing your answers. So this whole thing I included only to make sure that I convey these important answer writing tips to you. Now we'll move on to the next topic. The next topic is the analysis of AFSPA, which is Armed Forces Special Powers Act. It is a part of your security topic under your GS3 syllabus. So in this case was a Shopian encounter where an encounter had happened where the armed forces, the army had actually killed 3 people. So the army claimed that these 3 people were unidentified terrorists or the militants, but however it was alleged that these 3 people were actually not terrorists, but they were rather laborers who hailed from the Rajouri in the Pirpanjal Valley. So therefore it was alleged that the army had named them as unidentified terrorists, but rather they were only laborers and normal civilians, and they were not terrorists or militants. So on these allegations, the armed forces, the army had conducted an inquiry into the entire encounter episode, and now it has been found through this inquiry that the powers that has been vested to the armed forces under the AFSPA was actually exceeded in this particular encounter case. So this is an example of where AFSPA could have been misused by the armed forces, which is actually the special powers that has been entrusted to the armed forces to work in such environment where there is lot of insurgency or militancy. So this is an example that you can quote while you're analyzing the AFSPA. And with this, there was also a committee that was set up to suggest if AFSPA needs to be continued or not. So you have to tell in the comment section the name of this committee and what was its major recommendation. So this is your little homework for today. Now we'll move on to the next topic. So the next topic is, I have taken this topic to ensure that whenever you read any topic, the topic as such may not be too important to be noted down, but there will be some important words which you need to use in your answer writing. So this whole topic is just to illustrate the importance of using some keywords in your answer writing and making sure that you write those keywords and underlining them. So recently, as you all know, because of the pandemic, the schools have been shut down and children are forced to learn from their homes. But however, there are several economically weaker sections in our society who don't have access to facilities of internet. So we are well aware of the challenges of digital divide that is existing in the country. So in this case, what the Delhi High Court has said is there is what is called as a digital apartheid. So this is a keyword. Such keywords you have to collect and make sure that you use such keywords in your answers. So you need to have a collection of such keywords at the end of your preparation, by the end of your preparation, and you need to revise these keywords multiple times and make sure that you write them in capitals and in block letters and underline them when you're writing your answers. So what the Delhi High Court has acknowledged is that there is what is called as digital apartheid, where some of the economically weaker sections do not have access to the internet facilities. So thereby they are deprived of the online classes that are happening. So they are being deprived of their access to education itself. So the Delhi High Court has asked the private schools to give facilities to these economically weaker sections, give them the devices through which they are going to access the online classes, and also give them the internet packages, the data packages through which they are going to access these online content. So all this is needed. Why? Because we need to end this digital apartheid, where there is a discrimination against the weaker sections who do not have access to the digital resources, and thereby they are deprived of their right to get education. So such keywords, you have to make a list. Whenever you see such articles and such keywords, you separately in a sheet of paper make a list of these keywords and then keep them ready to revise before your exam. Now we move on to the last topic. The next topic is climate change. Climate change is a part of your GS1 syllabus, which talks about the changes in the flora fauna related to climate change. It can also be a part of your GS3 syllabus under the section of environment. So this article is talking about the glacier retreat that is happening in the Himalayas and how it can impact the water crisis. So first thing is you may be having a question like analyze the impact of climate change on various sectors in the economy. So one of that is the water also. So water is one important, availability of water is one important area where the climate change is going to have an impact on. So in this case, this topic becomes very important. So you have to mention that because of climate change, there is the Himalayan glaciers are getting retreated, and this is affecting the water availability in the Himalayan states, and particularly in the downstream, the water availability is affected. So also this whole study this study was done by the Observer Research Foundation, and this study has noted that the glaciers in the Himalayan Hindu Kush they are retreating, and because of this it is affecting the surface water in the Himalayan regions. So not just the surface water, it is also affecting the groundwater in the Himalayan region, and because of this the springs in that region are getting affected. In fact, the local population in these areas is dependent on the springs. So therefore it is ending up affecting the local population in these regions because the glaciers are retreating in the Himalayan Hindu Kush region. This whole thing is the finding by a study that was conducted by Observer Research Foundation. So one more thing that I want to point out here is, apart from the content of this, usually whenever we are writing answers, we emphasize more on writing data in support of your arguments. Suppose this question comes that analyze the impact of climate change on various sectors, and you will be, let's say, analyzing the impact on some 5 to 8 sectors. So in this case it is not necessary, and in fact you should not write data in each of the 8 points, because that will be like overuse of data, and just by looking at the figures in every other point the evaluator will feel that you have overused too much of data, which is not really essential. So out of 8 points, maybe in 3-4 points you can use data, which will be good enough. So always remember that no matter how much data you have, it is not needed that in the same answer itself you should show all the data that you have. So in all the 8 points some people end up writing data, so that is a big no, and that should not be done. So in such cases, when you are not writing data, you can write the important findings or observations by some such important organizations. So in this case there is no specific data in the terms of figures, but it is a study by the Observer Research Foundation which has found that the Himalayan glaciers are retreating, because of which the surface water and groundwater availability in the Himalayan states is reducing, and that is affecting the population there, and that is leading to a water crisis. So this whole thing you can write by adding that this was found under a study by the Observer Research Foundation. Without writing any figures, you are writing the name of Observer Research Foundation, and then you are writing the impact. So this will give that weightage to your point also, because you are basing your point on the study by ORF, but at the same time you are not overusing data. So this was about the climate change. Now we move on to the next topic. This is the last topic, which is related to the Indus Water Treaty. So international treaties, conventions, etc. are a part of your GS2 syllabus. So you may get a question on the Indus Water Treaty in your paper 2. And this topic is very important this year, because this year also marks the 60th anniversary of signing of the Indus Water Treaty. So this makes the topic very important, and you can expect a question in your mains. So this whole article was arguing firstly that why there is a need for renegotiating this treaty, that 60 years have elapsed since the negotiation of this treaty, which was brokered by the World Bank. So why do we need to renegotiate it now? So it gives 3 arguments. First is that there are the hydrological realities today are very different from the ones that existed when this treaty was signed. Today we have advanced engineering methods for construction of dams and for storing of the water, and also we have desiltation methods which can increase the carrying capacity of the dams and so on. So therefore there is a need to renegotiate the whole Indus Water Treaty. So these are the 3 arguments that it gives. Apart from this, this article tells one of the major issue that is associated with this treaty, which is a poor utilization on part of India. So Indus Water Treaty as such, how it gave the control over the eastern rivers to India and western rivers to Pakistan, we have already seen earlier in one of the ICANN videos. So in this article it says that there is a poor utilization on part of India while using the Indus river waters is concerned. So India has a right to build dams for the purpose of electricity generation without storing water for over the western rivers. So that is why we have many run of the river projects on the western rivers, which actually don't store any water, but rather they are used to just produce electricity, hydroelectricity. But India has utilized this very poorly. So this is supported with the help of data in the article. It says that there is 3.6 million acre feet of permissible storage capacity that was granted to India under the Indus Water Treaty over the western rivers. So this is the permissible storage capacity for India. But out of this, we have whatever developmental projects we have carried out over the western rivers and whatever dams we have built, this much of storage capacity we are not using. So in fact, 2 to 3 million acre foot of water easily flows into Pakistan. So therefore, there is a underutilization of the storage that India is actually granted under Indus Water Treaty under the permissible storage capacity. The second thing it says is as we can generate electricity from the western rivers also, out of the total estimated capacity of more than 11,000 megawatts of electricity that we can actually generate from the 3 western rivers, we have generated just more than 3,000 megawatts of electricity. Only this much has been tapped, while this is the potential there. This is the estimated capacity, but only this much has been tapped. So in this electricity generation also, there is a huge underutilization, and India will have to work on this respect and increase the utilization of the rights that it already has before it wants to further renegotiate the treaty. So these were the other articles that were either not important from the exam point of view or covered earlier. So that is it for today. Thank you.